that buck was super aggressive. I was like, all right, I'm going to get my grunt call out and see if I can call him in. I said, it's going to be like a 5-yard shot, probably frontal coming through, but let me see if it works. And I just start, and in the video, you can't hear it, but you can see him looking up the hill, and he's like, and he starts coming up part ways, but he didn't want to get away from that doe, and he goes over, and it's going, back and forth, and I'm like, I can see what I think is the bottom of that hill. I'm like, he's got to be right there, because I could hear him just making the most vocal grunts and noises. And eventually I tried making one more move, and that doe blows out, and she was probably 8 yards from me at that point, and had no idea at that time. So they ran out, and I just sprinted out to the other side of the hill, and he comes out.
To watch where they're going.
To watch where they're going, and he ends up coming relatively close, and I ranged him about 60 yards. I was like, he's looking right up at me. I was like, I'm not shooting that. It's not a good shot opportunity to do that. He wasn't really worried about me. He was worried about that doe. And they go and they take off, and they go into this wide open bottom.
At this point, how long had it been? How long was the stalk starting on the original 6 point and getting back into those deer? How long were you in right there?
Over 3 hours at that point.
Okay. I wanted the listeners to picture that instead of the 10-minute story that we've told right now, that this is a cat and mouse game of 3 hours.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
I think it's important for the listeners to know that you just didn't run out there and get on this deer.
No.
You've been in it now since right after daylight.
In the morning, it was frosty.
Yeah.
So about 32 degrees or so, somewhere at least 32 degrees, right around there. And at the time I ended up shooting, so it's going to be a few hours later, it was over 70 degrees. So in that time span, and I had my clothes on for 32 degrees other than I took off my puffy jacket, but I had my heavyweight base layers. I had my 330 weight merino base layers, my Timberline pants. So they're a little heavier of a pant. And, I had my base layer, my hoodie on, my vest, and then another jacket over top of it. I had a lot. So I ended up taking off the outer layer jacket. So yeah, there's over 3 hours lapse in this time, and that buck and doe run across this wide open bottom. And it's funny because the way this bottom looked was it was super flat, and there was one strip of trees that went down it where I actually had a camera in there, a camera that I had put out in the summertime based off of glassing these deer going down and hitting this licking branch and dropping down the same trail on this bottom. So they were right there, and they go out in the middle of this bottom and they lay down, and I watched them lay down, but they disappeared in what looked like wide open country. It took me a good 15 minutes to catch a flash of an antler that he was still laying there. And I was like, I remember I snuck down off this ridge, and there was this old coal road there. And I was like, if I'm going to make this happen, I'm going to have to crawl the rest of the way, because there's no cover. It was just wide open. And I contemplated really hard, Josh, of just like saying, that was it. Like, I need to go back up to the glassing point. In my head, I was like, my coffee, my food, my water, it's all up there on that hill.
Josh was on the other shoulder going, aggressive.
I said to myself at that point, you only have to do this thing right one time for it to work out. But you going up there and trying to find another buck or try to find where he's at better, all you're doing is starting all over again. And you have an opportunity here. If you do everything right, you can make this happen, but you're going to have to be slow, and you're going to have to, pay attention to every movement that you have. And the other hard part was the wind was blowing somewhat towards them, but just off. And so the whole time I'm just taking little milkweed and I'm tossing it. I'm like, man, it's close to hitting them. If we get a shift, it's going to be bad. But it was on the tops where it's open and flat, you get more of a consistent wind that's coming across. Yep. So I was like, I got to trust that. And it's funny in the video, you see me crawling across this road. Thank God for the knee pads in those pants, because like, I was just crawling across. And at this point, the Josh that was my camera guy with me, I said, hey, like, I know you really want to get this on film, and I really want you to get this on film, but it's too high risk to have someone there over my shoulder. And knowing that Jacob was up there on the hill filming, I was like, just sit here in this bush. At this point, I just started crawling, and to try to make a long story short, the next 3 hours I spent really moving about 200 yards. And that, I mean, if I were to guess, yardage is about 300 yards to begin with, and I was trying to range stuff in that grass is really, really difficult. It's blowing back and forth, sun's beating down. It's hard to get a range, but I saw a tree that I was assuming was about 25 yards from where they were bedded at. So I'd range that, and I was like, if I can get close to that tree, now I'm going to be, in the game. And I remember as I was crawling in, that buck would get up every 15, 20 minutes and do a little circle around that doe. And, and that's when I ended up spotting her. It took me forever to see her laying there. I would crawl every time the wind would blow, because it was quiet, and, it's hard to be quiet as you're moving through there. So sometimes it would be I could move kind of steadily for 10 seconds, and then there would be maybe a 10-minute lapse where it was just dead calm. And then a big wind gust would come, and that's when I'd make another move. And I just kept doing that, and to the point where I remember seeing this spot right outside of that tree at that 25-yard window that was just dirt that was there, an open patch. I'm like, if I can get to that point, I can move laterally left and right without making any noise, because it was like soft clay type dirt. And I get to that spot, and I watch the buck mount that doe, do his business. I mean, it was a pretty quick job for him, but he got his job.
He was a 2-pump chump. That's a fact.
And I mean, that deer definitely spent a lot of time in the open for how white his antlers were. Like there was no chocolate to that rack at all.
No, and when the sun hit that deer's horns, you get different angles, different views, and everything from the shade and the sun. And when you get across the road and get to that dirt pile, what are you in? 5 hours?
Yeah,
5.5.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds crazy when I say I was on a deer for a better part of 8 hours, and people talk about these 5-6 hour stalks. I mean, you're in it over 5 hours now. And the deer gets up, doe gets up, he mounts her. I mean, you saw that up close and personal, which is killer. And then, does he see you?
No.
Because I'm just wondering, because I've had deer see an object, get curious, because that deer start walking straight to you.
Yeah, no, and it wasn't as straight to me as it looked on the camera.
Okay.
So he was quartering towards me slightly, but what I found out was, after I ended up shooting here, was he was there was like a ring trail around that thicket. So I'm assuming that there was, this is a spot that bucks push does sometimes, and they get in there and they do circles around it. So he was like walking a circle around it. And I had thought like kind of the same thing. Like maybe he saw me, he was curious, but I think he was just making a lap around that. He just bred her, and he's just like all, his brain's kind of all foggy and all fired up at that point, and he's just kind of like strutting around before he goes lays back down. And he was working his way around there. I'm like, man, this can be my opportunity. And I don't believe I ranged it at that point. I just knew that, or from my estimation, I figured it was about 28 yards to that edge there. And he came around, and I went to full draw. I was on my knees. And I remember him stopping on his own, and he was looking back, and I was going to shoot. And there was just like, it was quartering to a little bit more. And going back to lessons learned, I was like, he's calm. He doesn't know I'm here. Don't rush the shot. And I was like, don't rush the shot. And I kept saying that to myself. And so he started walking again. Then he came into the wide open there, basically perfectly broadside. And that's when I stopped him. And I figured 28 yards. I held my 25-yard pin high lung, and I shot. And that's ended up where I was hitting at. So he might have been right about 25 yards. I mean, it felt like the perfect shot. And you can see it in the video, and I didn't even know I did it. But as soon as I shot, I did what my uncle did on his mule deer in South Dakota. I fist pumped before, like, I think the arrow even hit. Like, I was just like...
You just knew it.
I just knew, like, everything felt so good. I was like, yes. And he runs off, and I see him go into this underneath this tree, and I don't see him come out the other side. And I kind of like fall over. I'm like, oh my gosh, it just happened. I did it. And then all of a sudden your brain starts working and this panic comes in. Like, did I actually see that? Like, quit acting like this, quit being over dramatic and laying on the ground here and get up and see where he's at. And I'm looking up and I'm like, I can't see him. And then I just see the doe walking back over towards where he was at. I'm like, did I miss him? Like, what happened here? Like, I'm pretty sure I saw that arrow go, where I intended it to. And then finally I was like, yeah, he's laying there under that tree.